Gladys, look at yourself. 5 years of wearing that same faded headscarf, your skin darkened by the relentless sun, and your hands wrinkled like old paper from years of labor. Is this the life you dreamed of when you sold your family's hope to fund his future? You stand here in your simple patterned dress, pointing a trembling hand in utter disbelief as your world collapses in a single heartbeat. There stands Emma, polished and confident in a dark tailored suit, wearing a calm, satisfied smile that feels like a dagger. Beside him, Clara glows in a bright yellow dress, her face radiant as she flashes a gold engagement ring, the very one Emma promised to place on your finger. The contrast is a cruel joke. Your sacrifice bought his status, but he chose her to share it. While watching this video, kindly hit the subscribe button, like, and comment on where you are watching it from. I want to know how far the story has traveled. Let me also hear your thoughts at the end of this story. Let me tell you how it all began. It was a rainy Tuesday in the village square when Gladys first saw Emma, looking like a man whose dreams had been trampled into the mud. He was sitting on a wooden bench, his head in his hands, staring at an admission letter from the University of Lagos as if it were a death warrant rather than a golden ticket. Gladys, who had spent the morning selling roasted corn, approached him with a kind heart that had always been her greatest strength and her hidden peril. "Brother, why is your face like a dark cloud?" she asked softly. Emma looked up, his handsome features twisted in a mask of genuine despair. He told her the story she so desperately wanted to believe. He had the brains and the admission, but his father was gone and his mother was a lowly petty trader with nothing left to sell. "I just need one miracle," Emma whispered, his eyes filling with tears that made Gladys's chest tighten with a misplaced sense of duty. "If I miss this chance, I will be stuck in this village forever, and my family's story will never change. Gladys, you are the only one who looks at me with mercy." He took her calloused hands in his, hands that already bore the marks of hard work, and made the promise that would bind her for the next 5 years. "If you stand by me, I swear on my life, your sacrifice will be the foundation of our mansion. I will marry you the moment I wear that graduation gown. Your success will be my success." Gladys didn't hesitate, for she was a woman who saw a seedling and envisioned a forest. She thought of the small inheritance her aunt had left her, intended for her own tailoring shop, and decided right then that her dreams could wait so his could fly. "We are in this together, Emma," she replied, her voice steady even as she signed away her own future. She committed herself to the grind, promising to fund his tuition, his books, and his life, while she remained behind in the dust. She believed she was investing in a partner, not realizing she was merely acting as a human ladder for a man who was already looking for a way to climb higher than she could ever reach. The seasons began to blur into a relentless cycle of heat and dust, and with every passing month, the Gladys who once dreamed of a white wedding dress began to disappear. She became a woman of salt and sweat, a fixture of the roadside where she sold her roasted corn and tubers under the unforgiving sun. To save every kobo for Emma's mounting fees, she stopped buying the colorful fabrics she loved, she stopped using the creams that kept her skin soft. Her reflection in the bucket of water each morning became a stranger, a woman with hollowed eyes and a headscarf that had faded from a vibrant indigo to a ghostly, tired gray. Every time she managed to scrape together a few thousand naira, she didn't think of the shoes she desperately needed to replace her thinning slippers. Instead, she thought of Emma's textbooks, his internet data, and the polished shoes he needed to look the part among his peers in the city. When her friends at the market teased her, calling her the professor's wife, and mocking her tattered appearance, Gladys would only smile with a quiet, stubborn pride. "Let him shine now," she would tell them, "so that we can both glow later. A man's success is the crown of the woman who built him." She lived on the scraps of her own labor, eating the burnt edges of the corn she couldn't sell, while she sent the bulk of her earnings to Emma's bank account. On the few occasions he visited, he looked more like a stranger, his skin was becoming smooth, his clothes were crisp, and his speech was full of big words that seemed to create a wall between them. He would kiss her forehead and call her his sacrificial lamb, a title she wore like a badge of honor, never realizing that a lamb's only destiny is the slaughter. She was pouring her youth into a vessel that was slowly turning away from her, polishing a diamond that would soon decide she was nothing more than the rough, discarded stone that had protected it. But Gladys kept working, her hands becoming rough and her back beginning to ache, fueled by the hollow promise that these 5 years of rags were merely the prelude to a lifetime of silk. The shift happened gradually, like the slow cooling of a harmattan evening, until the warmth Gladys once felt in Emma's presence was replaced by a chilling distance. Emma had graduated and secured a position at a prestigious firm in the city, and with the first few paychecks that Gladys's sacrifices had made possible, he began to craft a new identity. He moved into an apartment with white walls and glass windows, far from the dusty roadside where Gladys still labored. When he spoke now, he no longer talked about our future, he spoke about his career trajectory, his brand, and the circles he was now expected to move in. One Saturday, Gladys traveled to the city to surprise him, carrying a heavy bag of garden eggs and roasted groundnuts, his favorites from the village. She arrived at his office building, her feet dusty in her worn slippers and her head wrapped in that same faded indigo scarf. When Emma stepped out of the elevator, surrounded by colleagues in crisp white shirts and silk ties, his face didn't light up with the joy of a man seeing his savior. Instead, his expression soured into one of deep, visible shame. He hurried toward her, not to embrace her, but to shield her from the view of his new friends. "Gladys, what are you doing here looking like this?" he hissed, his voice a sharp blade that cut through her excitement. He didn't look at the gift she held, he only looked at the stains on her dress and the rough texture of her skin. To Emma, Gladys was no longer the woman who had saved his life, she was a living receipt of a debt he didn't want to pay. She was a reminder of a humble past he was desperate to bury. Throughout that afternoon, he kept her hidden in the corners of his life, walking several paces ahead of her on the street so people wouldn't think they were together. When she tried to hold his hand, he pulled away to check his expensive watch. "You don't understand the corporate world, Gladys," he told her coldly. "Appearance is everything. You can't just show up looking like a peasant and expect me to maintain my respect." He looked at her not with love, but with the clinical eye of a man judging an old, broken tool that had served its purpose but no longer fit the modern workshop. Gladys returned to the village that night with her bag of groundnuts still full, her heart heavy with the realization that the man she had polished now found her too dull to be seen beside him. As Emma climbed the ranks of his new world, the space beside him was no longer vacant, though Gladys remained blissfully unaware in her village stall. Enter Clara, a woman who didn't know the scent of wood smoke or the weight of a water basin. Clara was the daughter of one of the firm's directors, a woman whose skin was polished by expensive spas and whose laughter sounded like the clinking of fine crystal. She was the upgrade Emma felt he deserved, the final piece of the puzzle in his new, sophisticated life. Emma began to implement a cruel strategy of silence and shadows. He stopped taking Gladys's calls, later texting that he was in high-level meetings or traveling for business. In reality, he was at candlelit dinners with Clara, listening to her talk about European vacations while he conveniently edited Gladys out of his history. To Clara, he was a self-made man who had risen by his own bootstraps. To Emma, Clara was the prize for a race Gladys had run for him. The lies became more elaborate. When Gladys asked about their wedding date, the promise that had sustained her through 5 years of hunger, Emma's voice would turn cold and defensive. "The economy is unstable, Gladys. I need to consolidate my position first. Don't be so pushy, it's unappealing." He was grooming himself for a life that had no room for a woman with cracked heels and faded headscarves. Clara became the sun around which Emma's new world revolved. He began to buy Clara the perfumes and jewelry that Gladys had only ever seen in discarded magazines. He justified his betrayal by telling himself that he and Gladys were now unequally yoked, a classic deception of the ungrateful heart. He wasn't just cheating on a girlfriend, he was systematically erasing the woman who had built him, replacing her with a shiny new model who had never seen him when he was nothing. While Gladys was at home praying for their success, Emma was already practicing how to say, "I do," to a woman who wouldn't remind him of where he came from. The shadow of Clara grew longer every day, slowly eclipsing the flickering light of Gladys's fading hope. The silence from Emma had become a deafening roar, a cold wall that Gladys could no longer ignore. Driven by a desperate need to salvage the remnants of her hope, she took the last of her savings, money intended for the roof of their future home, and traveled to the city one final time. She wanted to surprise him, to remind him of the woman who had carried his burdens on her head for 60 long months. She imagined him seeing her and finally saying, "Gladys, it is time. Let us pick the rings." When she arrived at his high-rise apartment, the door was slightly ajar, the sound of rhythmic, joyful music spilling into the hallway. Gladys stepped inside, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The living room was filled with the scent of expensive lilies and imported wine. There, on the mahogany coffee table, sat a small, velvet box, its lid open to reveal a diamond that caught the light and shattered it into 1,000 mocking rainbows. Gladys felt a surge of dizzying relief. He did it, she thought, her eyes filling with tears. After 5 years of rags, he finally bought the ring. She reached out a trembling, calloused hand to touch the cold metal, but before her fingers could graze the velvet, a voice stopped her cold. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" Gladys spun around to see Emma standing in the hallway, looking sharper than she had ever seen him. But his eyes held no warmth, only a terrifying, clinical detachment. Behind him stepped Clara, draped in silk, her skin glowing with the ease of a woman who had never known a day of hunger. "Emma?" Gladys whispered, her voice cracking. Is this for us?" Emma didn't even flinch. He walked past her as if she were a piece of furniture that had been moved out of place. He picked up the box and turned to Clara, sliding the ring onto her manicured finger. The fit was perfect. The finality of the click as the box closed sounded like a casket shutting on Gladys's youth. "Gladys, go home," Emma said, his voice devoid of even the mercy of anger. "The ring is for Clara. She is the woman who matches where I am going, not where I have been. You were the help I needed to get here, but the journey is over." The world tilted. Gladys looked from the sparkling diamond to her own rough, empty hands, the hands that had paid for the very education that gave him the status to reject her. In that moment, the day of finality arrived not with a bang, but with the crushing realization that she had spent 5 years building a palace she would never be allowed to enter. The engagement she had fasted and prayed for was real, but the bride was a stranger. The day of the engagement party was a spectacle of wealth that Gladys's sweat had unwittingly sponsored. Driven by a grief that felt like fire in her veins, she pushed past the polished security guards, her faded headscarf a lonely splash of dull blue against a sea of silk and gold. She found them on the raised dais, surrounded by the elite of the city, laughing over flutes of champagne. When Emma saw her, his laughter didn't just die, it turned into a cold, hard mask of loathing. "Emma!" Gladys cried out, her voice raw and trembling, echoing through the silent hall. 5 years. I gave you 5 years of my life. I sold my family's land so you could sit in these chairs. How can you stand there with her?" The guests whispered, their eyes darting from Gladys's cracked heels to Clara's designer gown. Emma stepped down from the dais, not to offer a hand, but to draw a line in the sand. He didn't look at her with guilt, he looked at her with the disgust one reserves for a stain on a white shirt. "Look at you, Gladys," he said, his voice loud enough for every dignitary to hear. "You are a ghost from a life I have outgrown. You stand here smelling of wood smoke, roasted corn, and the dusty roadside, and you expect to sit at a table of kings?" He stepped closer, his tailored suit mocking her tattered dress. "You weren't a partner, Gladys. You were a bridge. And nobody lives on a bridge once they've reached the other side. You are the pure water of my life, cheap, necessary for a moment of thirst, but easily discarded once the thirst is gone." He turned to the crowd, gesturing toward her as if she were a cautionary tale. "She represents a version of me that no longer exists. I am a man of status now, and status requires a woman who was born for the light, not one who is comfortable in the dirt. You don't fit my world, Gladys. You smell of the past, and I am only interested in the future. With a flick of his wrist, he signaled the guards. Take her out. She's making the air heavy with her bitterness. As they dragged her away, Gladys's screams were drowned out by the restart of the music. She realized then that the man she had loved was dead, replaced by a monster she had fed with her own life's blood. He hadn't just broken her heart, he had tried to erase her very existence, leaving her in the dust of the status he had built upon her back. The cold pavement of the event center was the last thing Gladys felt before the world went black. She didn't just faint, she collapsed under the weight of 5 years of wasted breath. When she finally opened her eyes, she wasn't in a palace, but back in the market, lying on a wooden bench beneath the shade of an umbrella. Mama Gold and the other market women were hovering over her, their faces etched with a mixture of pity and fierce anger. Drink this, Mama Gold commanded, pressing a cup of cold water to Gladys's parched lips. Gladys tried to weep, to wail for the land she had sold and the youth she had buried, but Mama Gold slapped the bench with a sound like a gunshot. Enough. You have cried enough for a man who used you like a disposable rag. Do you want to die so he can feel even more superior? Do you want to be the sad story he tells his new wife? The words stung more than the betrayal. Gladys looked at her hands, rough, scarred, and empty. But then, a flicker of something new ignited in her chest. It wasn't just sadness, it was a productive rage, a fire that didn't want to burn down the world, but wanted to build a fortress. I have nothing left, Gladys whispered. You have the same hands that built a graduate from nothing, Mama Gold countered, reaching into her apron and pulling out a small bundle of crumpled Naira notes. The other women stepped forward, adding their own contributions, small tokens of sisterhood from their daily gains. This is not charity, Gladys. This is seed. You fed a wolf for 5 years, now, it is time to feed yourself. Gladys stood up, shaking off the dust of her humiliation. She didn't buy new clothes or a better headscarf. Instead, she took that seed money and bought a small supply of high-quality grains, selling them with a hunger that made her previous labor look like child's play. She channeled every ounce of her heartbreak into her hustle. Every time she felt like giving up, she remembered the smell of the lilies at Emma's party and the way he said she smelled of the past. She decided right then that if she was going to be the past, she would be the most expensive history he ever regretted leaving behind. Within months, her small stall became 2, then 4. She was no longer just a girl selling corn, she was a woman building an empire, fueled by the realization that her worth was never tied to the man she carried, but to the strength of the back that had carried him. The years passed, and the seeds of Gladys's productive rage blossomed into an orchard of prosperity. No longer was she the woman of the dusty roadside, she had become the CEO of Gladys Grains and Logistics, a powerhouse with a fleet of trucks that crisscrossed the country. Her skin, once parched and neglected, now glowed with the radiance of a woman who nurtured herself. She traded the faded indigo headscarf for elegant silks, and her hands, though still bearing the faint marks of her labor, were adorned with the jewels of her own hard-earned success. She had become gold, not the kind a man places on a finger to show ownership, but the kind that is forged in the hottest furnace to prove its purity. Meanwhile, in the high-rise apartment that had once felt like a palace of betrayal, the walls were beginning to close in on Emma. The status he had traded his soul for was a house built on sand. Clara, the woman he chose because she'd matched his future, turned out to be a partner only for the harvest, never for the planting. When the economy shifted and Emma's firm began to downsize, his high salary vanished, but Clara's appetite for luxury did not. The clinking of fine crystal was replaced by the sharp, rhythmic sound of nagging. How can a man of your status be unable to afford my shopping trips? Clara would sneer, her polished beauty turning ugly with contempt. Every evening was a battlefield of debt notices and bitter recriminations. Emma realized too late that while Gladys had been his anchor, Clara was merely a sail that only worked when the wind was blowing in his favor. Now that the storm had arrived, he was drifting toward the rocks. He watched from the sidelines of the city's business news as Gladys's name became synonymous with excellence. He saw her on billboards, looking regal and untouchable, and the realization began to rot in his stomach. The woman he had discarded as pure water was the very source of the life he was now losing. He had kicked away the ladder, only to find himself stranded in a pit of his own making, while the ladder had grown wings and soared far beyond his reach. Karma had finally found Emma's address, and it didn't come with a bouquet of flowers. It came with a mirror, forcing him to see that in trying to upgrade his life, he had settled for a counterfeit, while the original gold was now out of his league forever. The end came not with a roar, but with a desperate knock on the mahogany doors of Gladys's executive office. When the door opened, it wasn't the powerful man of status who walked in, but a ghost of the man Gladys had once loved. Emma stood there, his tailored suit now frayed at the cuffs, his face lined with the gray exhaustion of a man who had lost everything. Beside him, Clara was no longer glowing. Her bright yellow dress was replaced by a dull, borrowed blouse, and her eyes were downcast, the heavy engagement ring long since sold to pay off predatory debts. "Gladys," Emma whispered, his voice trembling with a humility he had never shown when he was at the top. "We have nowhere else to go. The bank took the house, the car, even Clara's family has turned their backs on us. Please, for the sake of the 5 years we spent together, help me. I was blind. I didn't realize that you were the one who made me who I was." Gladys sat behind her desk, a vision of calm and earned grace. She didn't look at them with anger, for anger is a form of attachment, and she had long since detached herself from the anchor of his betrayal. She looked at him with the same clinical detachment he had used on her at the wedding. "Emma," she said softly, her voice carrying the weight of a woman who had built her own staircase to heaven. "You once told me that I was like pure water, necessary for a moment of thirst, but easily discarded once the thirst is gone. You told me I smelled of the past. Well, you were right. I am your past, and the past is a place where you no longer have an address." Clara stepped forward, her voice a pathetic whimper. "Please, Gladys, we are hungry." Gladys stood up, her silk dress rustling like the sound of success. She reached into her drawer, pulled out a small amount of cash, the exact price of a tray of corn, and placed it on the desk. "This is for your journey. Not because I owe you, but because I am no longer the woman who starves so others can eat. I am a woman who knows her worth." She signaled her secretary to open the door. "You asked for a second chance, Emma, but you already had 5 years of chances and you threw them away for a shadow. My life is now full of substance. You may leave." As they shuffled out, broken and defeated, Gladys walked to the window and looked out at the city she had conquered. The heavy burden she had carried for 5 years was finally gone. She wasn't just at peace, she was free. She had moved on, and in the silence of her success, she finally heard the only voice that mattered, her own, telling her that she was, and always had been, enough.